You're standing in your kitchen at 7 a.m. on a Tuesday, coffee's brewing, nobody's asking you anything, nobody's running late and blaming you for it, nobody needs you to be anything other than exactly what you are right now. A person, awake, in their own space, completely at peace, and somewhere in that silence, it hits you. This is the first time in years you felt like yourself, not recovering, not surviving, just yourself. That moment doesn't get talked about enough. The quiet victory of reclaimed mornings, the strange, unexpected contentment that shows up after the chaos settles, and for a growing number of people who have walked through divorce and come out the other side, that feeling doesn't fade. It deepens, and it starts raising a question nobody around them wants to acknowledge out loud. What if I don't want to do this again? At PsychoShift, we get into the real psychology behind major life transitions, the patterns that run underneath the surface that most content completely skips over. Today, we're going somewhere honest and a little uncomfortable because the most useful conversations usually are. Pull back the curtain on how marriage actually developed as a social structure, and something surprising shows up fast. For the majority of recorded human history, marriage had almost nothing to do with emotional fulfillment. It was a logistics agreement, property transfer, family alliance, labor and survival coordination. The idea that two people should marry because they're madly in love with each other and expect to remain deeply happy for the next 40 years together. That's an extraordinarily recent invention, like last 200 years recent. Pause and really sit with that for a second. We inherited a structure built for medieval land management, wrapped it in romantic mythology, added Hollywood's version of forever, loaded it with the expectation that one single person should satisfy your emotional, intellectual, financial, physical, and spiritual needs simultaneously across multiple decades of significant personal change, and then acted shocked when the whole thing collapsed at a staggering rate. The structure wasn't designed for what we're asking it to do, and when it breaks, the standard cultural prescription is simple: dust yourself off. Find someone new, and try the exact same structure again. Now, some people do exactly that and find genuine happiness the second time around. That's real, that's valid. But here's what almost never gets discussed. Some people walk away from that experience, think clearly about what they actually want their life to look like, and arrive at a completely different answer. Not out of fear, not out of bitterness, out of actual clarity, and that answer gets treated like a symptom rather than a conclusion. Let's talk about Daniel, 47, divorced after 9 years. No dramatic falling out, no explosive ending, just a slow growing apart that neither of them could reverse. He spent the first year post-divorce doing what everyone told him to do. Therapy, staying busy, leaning on friends, getting back into hobbies he'd abandoned. By year 2, something shifted. He stopped framing his solo life as a waiting room. He stopped using phrases like, "when I meet someone again," as a default assumption. He started building his days around what he genuinely wanted, not what two people had negotiated into a compromise neither was fully happy with. He wasn't closed off. He dated occasionally. He had close friendships that mattered deeply to him, but every time a relationship started developing real weight, the kind of weight that leads toward cohabitation, toward merging finances, toward legal permanence, he felt something contract rather than open. His counselor described it with a term worth knowing: autonomy restoration. After years of sustained compromise within a long-term partnership, certain individuals don't just want independence during recovery. They experience something close to a biological need for self-direction that doesn't diminish over time. It grows. The fascinating thing about autonomy research is what it reveals about long-term well-being. Studies consistently show that perceived control over one's own life is one of the strongest predictors of psychological health across adulthood. Not wealth, not relationship status. control. Now, marriage doesn't automatically destroy that sense of control, but a mismatched one absolutely can. And for someone who's experienced that specific erosion, rebuilding self-directed agency often becomes something they protect fiercely going forward. Where does that leave you practically? Take an honest inventory of how you feel when you make decisions alone versus when they require negotiation. Not in a relationship right now, in your daily life. Do you feel relief or loneliness when you answer only to yourself? That response is data about your own architecture. Pay attention to it. Pillar 1. Solitude as a skill. There's a version of aloneness that shrinks your world. You know this one. It's restless, avoidant, anxious. Always reaching for the phone, always needing noise, always feeling silence before it gets uncomfortable. Then there's a different version entirely. Deliberate, chosen, expansive. The kind where you sit on your back porch on a Saturday evening without an agenda and feel something that genuinely resembles contentment. These are not the same experience sharing the same name. One is involuntary absence. The other is intentional presence with yourself. After a long marriage ends, most people are genuinely out of practice with the second one. Years of coordinating with another person, their preferences, their schedule, their emotional weather can quietly erode your ability to just be with your own thoughts without immediately converting them into something actionable or shareable. Rebuilding that capacity is not optional if you want this path to actually work. It's foundational. Start with one unstructured evening per week. No screen, no content, no background noise. Cook something, walk somewhere unfamiliar, sit with whatever comes up. The first few times, it might feel strangely uncomfortable, almost like you're waiting for something. That discomfort is the sound of a mental muscle that hasn't been used in a while. The more you exercise it, the quieter and more spacious your own inner world becomes. Pillar 2. Commitment without ceremony. Right now, someone reading this is thinking, if I never marry again, doesn't that mean I'll never have that deep, anchoring connection? Watch what happens when you actually question that assumption. Think about your oldest friendship, not a convenient one, a real one. The person who has known multiple versions of you across decades, who knew you before your marriage, knew you during it, and knows you now. Nobody signed anything for that relationship to hold. No judge blessed it, no ceremony made it official, and yet, call that person tonight with a genuine crisis. See what happens. That's commitment operating without contract. And for people consciously building a post-marriage life, this principle becomes an organizing philosophy, not avoiding deep connection, but distributing it intentionally across multiple meaningful relationships, rather than funneling everything into a single legally bound partnership. Social psychologists have a framework for this. Diversified attachment networks. The research shows that people who maintain several high-quality close relationships across different categories, longtime friends, family, community, consistently report higher emotional resilience and life satisfaction than those whose primary emotional bonds are concentrated in a single partnership, particularly when that partnership is under strain. Your move here: map your actual emotional landscape, not your contact list, your real connections. Who could you call right now with the full, honest, messy truth of something you're going through? If that answer is one person, that's a vulnerability worth addressing regardless of your relationship status. Pillar 3. Financial self-direction. This conversation gets skipped in most rebuilding after divorce content because money feels less interesting than emotional healing. Big mistake. The financial experience of living fully on your own after a long marriage where household finances were in any way shared or dependent is one of the most psychologically transforming shifts you'll go through, and it almost always moves in a direction nobody anticipates. Meet Carolyn, 53, divorced after 14 years. Spent the first 8 months genuinely anxious about money. Her marriage had split financial responsibilities in a way that left her underdeveloped on the investment and planning side. Coming out the other side, she was essentially starting from educational zero in her early 50s, 3 years later, she'll tell you clearly that financial independence is one of the primary reasons she has no desire to legally merge her life with anyone again. Not because she's selfish, because she spent 2 decades inside a dynamic where her financial decisions were entangled with someone else's preferences, fears, and patterns. And untangling all of that and discovering her own financial instincts was one of the most empowering experiences of her adult life. The control isn't about greed, it's about identity. When every financial decision is purely yours, the savings rate, the investment choices, the I'm going to fly somewhere on short notice because I can moments, something in your self-concept firms up in a way that's genuinely hard to describe until you've experienced it. Practical starting point. If financial confidence is still a gap, treat it as a skill acquisition project with a 6-month timeline. 1 concept per week. Interest compounding, diversified accounts, emergency fund sizing, retirement trajectory, 40 minutes of focused learning weekly, consistently applied, produces financial fluency faster than most people believe is possible. Pillar 4, recovering the self that got quietly negotiated away. Here's the one that cuts deepest. Long-term marriage involves ongoing identity negotiation. Usually it's subtle, and it happens slowly. Your social circle gradually becomes the couple's social circle. Your weekend habits adjust to accommodate 2 people's needs. Your professional ambitions get weighed against shared logistics. Even your sense of humor, your political evolution, your aesthetic preferences, all of it gets shaped in part by sustained proximity to another person's reality. None of this is malicious. It's just how deep partnership works. But when the partnership ends, what remains is a version of you that is partly original and partly constructed through years of co-authorship. And one of the most disorienting and ultimately liberating parts of rebuilding is figuring out which parts are genuinely yours. What would you eat for dinner if optimizing for exactly one person's taste? Where would you live if only your preferences counted? What project would you pursue if the only person whose opinion mattered was yours? These feel like small questions. They are not small questions. They are the questions that, answered honestly and repeatedly over months, gradually reconstruct a self-directed identity that doesn't require external validation to hold its shape. Your next step here, pick one domain of your life that felt heavily negotiated inside your marriage, and make one completely autonomous choice within it this week. New habit, new space arrangement, new weekend plan, something small, but entirely, unambiguously yours. There's a specific social exhaustion that comes with this choice that rarely gets named. It's not one big confrontation, it's 1,000 small moments. The relative who asks at every gathering whether you're seeing anyone. The colleague who introduces you to someone at a work event with a look that says they're trying to help. The friend who keeps saying, you just need to get back out there, as though your considered decision is a temporary phase they're planning to outlast. None of these people mean harm. That's what makes it draining rather than just annoying. What's actually happening underneath the surface is worth understanding. When you opt out of a social script that someone else is still faithfully following, your visible contentment becomes an implicit challenge to their assumptions. You're not trying to challenge anything, but your existence as a happy, whole person who chose a different structure raises a question they'd rather not engage with directly. You don't owe anyone an argument. You don't need to defend a choice that isn't harming anyone. What you do need is a response that communicates settled, finality without hostility or apology. Something like, my life is genuinely built the way I want it right now. Delivered calmly, not as a door opener for debate, not with a defensive edge, just a clear, warm, closed statement. The people in your life who respect you will adjust. The ones who can't accept it have revealed something about their relationship with their own choices, not something about yours. This path has real shadows. Pretending otherwise isn't useful to anyone. There will be stretches of time, not all the time, but stretches, where the quiet feels less like peace and more like absence, where you watch two people sharing something ordinary, a grocery run, a shared laugh about a private joke, and feel a specific weight in your chest that doesn't have a clean name. That's real. You don't reason your way out of it. You don't toxic positivity your way past it. There will be moments of significant personal difficulty, medical situations, professional setbacks, genuine grief, where you'll wish someone was physically present who carries the full context of your life, not just a friend who knows parts of you, but someone who knows all of it, who is there for the chapters that made you who you are now. Acknowledging this isn't weakness, it's accuracy, and the people who chose this path and stayed on it successfully aren't the ones who pretended these moments don't exist. They're the ones who built a life robust enough to hold those moments without collapsing. What that looks like practically, a small, genuinely close inner circle that knows the real version of you. Regular physical movement, not as an aesthetic project, but as nervous system maintenance. Creative output of some kind, writing, building, cooking, music, whatever, that gives your interior world somewhere to land, and the specific practiced willingness to say, this week was genuinely hard, to someone who won't panic about it. That's not a consolation prize version of connection. For a lot of people, it's richer and more sustaining than what they had inside a partnership that stopped actually seeing them years before it officially ended. One persistent misconception about this whole conversation is the image it conjures. Someone isolated, emotionally armored, having made a bitter peace with permanent solitude. That's almost never the accurate picture. Many people who consciously choose not to remarry are among the most openly loving people in any room. They show up for their people with a kind of uncomplicated generosity that can be harder to access when you're navigating the sustained complexity of a struggling marriage. They love without the undercurrent of resentment that accumulates in relationships held together more by inertia than genuine choice. What they have shifted isn't their emotional availability, it's their relationship with the idea that love requires official recognition to be legitimate. Some build long-term romantic partnerships that are deeply committed, genuinely loving, and intentionally structured without legal formalization. Two people choosing each other consistently, not because departure is legally complicated, but because they keep genuinely wanting to stay. Some build lives where the emotional core is a network of chosen family, friends who've earned that title through years of showing up in ways that matter, relationships that in some ways go deeper than many legal partnerships, because they're held entirely by voluntary, ongoing choice rather than contractual obligation. Neither of these lives is incomplete. Neither is a compromise version of the real thing. They are fully realized, fully inhabited lives built by people who looked honestly at all the available options and chose the one that actually fit, not the one they were expected to choose. Here's where all of this lands. The freedom blueprint isn't anti-love. It isn't anti-connection. It doesn't argue that legal marriage is wrong or that people who pursue it again are making a mistake. What it argues is simpler and more personal than that. The architecture of your life should be built around who you actually are today, your real needs, your genuine values, your hard-won self-knowledge, not around a default script that was handed to you before you had the experience to evaluate it clearly. You already paid an enormous cost for the education you carry, the disruption, the grief, the identity reconstruction, the starting over. Most people never voluntarily move through that. You did. Willingly or not, you came out the other side carrying something genuinely valuable, a clearer picture of what you need a life to look like in order to feel real. What you do with that clarity is entirely yours to decide. Maybe the life you're building looks quiet and deeply personal, a craft you've returned to, a city you've always wanted to try, mornings that belong only to you. Maybe it includes a meaningful partnership that operates outside traditional structures and works precisely because both people chose it from a place of wholeness rather than need. Maybe it looks like something that doesn't have a name yet, because you're still building the blueprint in real time. Whatever shape it takes, The only version that will genuinely hold is one constructed around your actual truth, not assembled from fear, not assembled from bitterness, not assembled because the familiar structure felt easier than facing the full weight of a blank page, but because you looked at your one life clearly, took it seriously, and built something that was actually worth inhabiting. That's not the absence of something, that's the whole point.